The past week has really been a very interesting period. We got a couple of dev diaries for EU5 where we learned a lot about the basic mechanics such as culture, how exactly culture is going to be working in EU5, and how language and what kind of language types, language families, culture families. We have a ton of information to digest, as well as we have another map Tinto talk of Southeast Asia afterwards we can discuss for a little bit too. More importantly though, we have the whole map of the world with the cultures and the languages presented by Paradox itself as part of this dev diary, which in my opinion shows a lot of things that we didn't know about before. This dev diary is brought over by Saint Dave UK, and he mentions that culture, as far as the development team is concerned, represents the vernacular, music, food, identity, ethnicity, art, and various other hard to define ideas. This is what makes up the culture of a nation. That's why in EU5 we have both culture and the language as completely separate things, and we're gonna see the language and cultural map mode in a few moments. We have a tooltip for Maratha, that is the culture Maratha. The language is Marathi, which is a part of the Indian culture group, and it also shows what countries have this primary culture at the start, namely Baglana and Banghugara. A new concept added with EU5 is cultural opinion. So to put this short, because I'm not going to read through this entire thing, I'm just going to summarize everything with these dev diaries. Cultural opinion is a metric between cultures where one culture will like or dislike another culture based on a few factors, such as relations between countries of those particular cultures. So say, for example, the Greeks hate the Turks. So to be more precise, if the Byzantines, which is the only Greek nation at the start of the campaign, has bad relations with the Anatolian Beyliks, which are old Turkic primary culture, then automatically the Greek culture will have a disdain for Turkic cultures as consequence. But it's not only that, there's other factors that will influence culture. Whether they are of the same religion will be very important, whether they have a similar culture group, because cultures will be a part of a culture group, of a bigger culture group, whether there's been wars between these cultures in recent years, etc. There will be a lot of things that will influence this cultural opinion. So this is a fluid sort of mechanic which changes with time between the different cultures. We have it as an example here. Catalan, that is 56% of the population, is of this particular culture. Kindred, basically the relations between other Catalans. It is the primary culture of the nation, so I'm assuming this is when they tagged into Aragon. Then we also have Aragonese as a secondary culture. It is an accepted culture. It is not the primary culture, and the relations between Catalans and Aragonese are positive. So that means Aragonese love the Catalans and the Catalans love the Aragonese back, whilst other cultures like Andalusi, Sephardine, Sardinians are neutral towards each other, and the Sardinian is a non-accepted culture despite Sephardi and Andalusi actually being tolerated. We'll get into that in a few moments, what exactly that means, because there's different tiers of acceptance in EU5. We also have a new mechanic, cultural capacity. Essentially, it's similar to EU4's accepted cultures mechanic, where cultural capacity is by default 1, and then as you progress in time, you will get more cultural capacity with advances from other ages. There might be other mechanics as well, I don't know yet, but we do know for sure that there's advances, and you use this cultural capacity to accept other cultures. As you can see here, Aragonese is 0.24, Andalusi 0.88, and Sephardi 0.14. Why is that? Well, Aragonese and Sephardi is more similar to the Catalan primary culture of Aragon, which is why it takes less points to accept these cultures, whilst Andalusi is a little bit more different, mostly because it's a Islamic culture, so it has 0.88 capacity. So that means it puts Aragon over the cultural capacity to accept all three of these by 0.26 points, and that means they get some debuffs, cultural tradition, influence, and efficiency of cabinet reduction as consequence. So this is a confirmation that you can go over your cultural capacity and you can accept the more cultures, but there's going to be a drawback to accepting those cultures, and that it's also going to be easier to accept cultures that are more similar to your primary culture. Dave confirms here it depends on relative size of the people also that you have. So if you have a lot of Aragonese, even though they're similar, but there's a lot of them, it's going to cost more to accept them cultural capacity wise. Also, opinion of those particular pops, culture group, and language is a main factor as well. We see here base tolerated cultures +1 1, and then certain things reduce that. Shared culture group reduces this by 15%. The amount of people versus the amount of your primary culture also increases. So because there's 1 million Andalusians versus less than a million Catalans, it's a little bit more expensive as well. We also have here cultural cost of Aragonese is +3 for accepted culture, making it an accepted culture, that is. Remember, that's different because for Andalusians, it's a tolerated culture. Accepted is a little bit more expensive, 3 times more expensive to be more precise. And look at the modifiers again. Shared culture group, shared language as primary culture or court language, as well as the fact that there's positive cultural opinion between the two cultures is a pretty big factor, 25%. By default, every culture is non-accepted to you. It is the default state and at best means you ignore it. Non-accepted pops are pretty miserable in your country and also do not provide any benefits. So that's the first level, non-accepted, right? Then you can make them tolerated cultures. If you have cultural capacity, you can make tolerated cultures. It will make them a little bit happier. They will grow as normal, and that's pretty much it. Accepted cultures will cost 3 times more cultural capacity. They will give more levies and sailors, however, and they count towards whether you can core a province. Remember that in order to core a province in EU5, you need to have, I think it was like 50% of the population in that province has to be either primary culture or accepted culture. Otherwise, you cannot core that province. And it also, having an accepted culture determines whether a colonial charter will flip to your ownership. And very important, accepted cultures cannot be slaves, and you cannot accept a culture that has the enemy cultural opinion. So that means Greeks cannot accept Turks, for example, as the two cultures will start as enemy cultures. Primary culture, very self-explanatory. It is your main population for your country. It influences how you get your advances, the unit types, because you will have different unit types based on the primary culture. So I might see some special units in India, we might see some special units in the East and the West and so on. It also influences government reforms, and you can swap your primary culture with an accepted culture if the requirements are fulfilled, such as the accepted culture becoming the dominant culture, meaning there's a lot more accepted pops than there is primary pops. Example of that is, say you play as Livonian order, right? And you have 500 Prussians, but you have 1 million Livonians. You can make Livonians, if they're accepted, your primary culture, because obviously there's more of those than there are Prussian. Now, there's a new concept that we have, language. Well, new for Europa Universalis series, at least. This has been around for CK3 and so on. Language is pretty self-explanatory. The language we use, right? It has 3 tiers in EU5: dialect, language, and language family. So, language family, the main ones, the Slavs in the eastern parts, and that includes Bohemia, Slovakia, Poland, the Russian parts. We also have the Turks, which is the Tatars, as well as the Turks, right, in Anatolia. They're a part of the same language group, which is accurate. And we have the Semitics, which is the Arabic-speaking people in Arabia and parts of North Africa and various parts of Africa, really, as well as, for some reason, a lot of them in Andalusia. I kind of think that should not be the case, though, because Andalusian pops, sure, they were Andalusians, but they didn't all speak Arabic, that's for sure. Then we have the Romance-speaking pops, which is the French, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Spanish, the Romanians we have here as well as part of the same language family, the Romance language family. Uralic is where the Hungarians are, the people on the Urals, and the Finnish and the Estonians. Germanic, of course, the English, the various Germans, and the Scandinavians. These are the main language families in Europe, and this is really accurate. I also like to see that they put Basque as a separate language family of its own. Same for the Livonians and the Lithuanians, their own language group. And I would assume Albanians are also their own language group. They did not put them in the Greek one. Now, language does have its own mechanics, though. So it represents the most common vernacular amongst its people and can, in some regards, be comparable to the EU4 culture groups in size. Languages also have language power, which is determined by which countries use that particular language as a court language, a common language, and a liturgical language, because there's 3 different levels. We have the language of the church, the liturgical one, the common language spoken by everybody, and the court language, the one spoken in the court. And we have different map modes for all 3 of these as well. You'll see those in a few seconds. We have here, for example, Spanish Spanish as a language. It shows the language family, a Romance, the language power, 30%, and it shows the various dialects of Spanish, Aragonese, Castellano, Latino, and Leonese. It also mentions that it is used by the Aragonese, Castilian, Astarlones, and Sephardi cultures. It also mentions how it's not a liturgical language of any religion. At the start of the campaign, most nations in Europe will have Latin as the liturgical language. At least the Catholics will have Latin as the main language of the church, which means that Latin is going to be a language available in EU5 at the start. So we might do some shenanigans, I would assume, where we can bring back the Roman Empire with Latin as the primary language. Again, this is just 100% assumption from the dev diaries, nothing more. Maybe I'm wrong, who's to say, right? Also mentions Spanish language is used as the court language by Castile and Navarra. Despite Navarra, the common language in Navarra would be Basque, but the court language is Spanish, so keep that in mind. Liturgical language is Latin, so Navarra has 3 separate languages, but all 3 different tiers. Oh, and there's a 4th one I forgot, the market language. We have Spanish language is the market language in the Sevilla market. Sorry, I have to scroll down. Is the Spanish is in the Sevilla market. Now we have here the map of the dominant language in these areas. It's not the only language, but it is the dominant language. So we've got here East Slavic, West Slavic, German, French, Occitan in the south, as well as in most of the Aragonese areas. It is also Occitan. Italian and Cisalpine in the northern parts of Italy, South Slavic, Romanian, Hungarian, German mixed all over Transylvania, Bulgarian, Greek, Turkish, Armenian, quite a lot of, Azeri as well. And then we go into Asia, we have a huge amount of different languages in India. We have Chinese, we also have Japanese here, Jurchen we still have in the northern parts of Manchuria, Mongolian around the steppes, still Kipchak, which is in the same family group as the Turkic one. Remember the previous map we saw Turkish and Kipchak a part of the same family group. Now another important aspect for language is the dialect. So all of those languages that you saw on that big map are divided in smaller dialects, basically versions of that language with a slight little bit of an accent or a slight little bit of a couple of regional words that are different from the main vernacular. Dave's mentions this is purely for flavor. There's no gameplay effect for the dialects. 2 dialects are considered identical for most purposes, such as opinion bonuses, and they also share the same stats like the language power. So as an example here, Leonese and Castilian are considered the same in the Spanish language and share the exact same language power. This is basically just a sort of a flavor sort of thing. And we have a better diving down into the different dialects. We have High German, Middle German, Low German. The real question though is, where did they get the ganja to get these High Germans, right? We also have an illustration of how it exactly works. We have Germanic, the language family. We have languages themselves as separate entities, which is English, Scandinavian, German, Frisian, and then the dialects for each of these. The English are Scots, Ibero-English, and English. Now, common language is quite frankly the language that is used by the primary culture. You cannot choose this language, but you can choose the liturgical language. So you can choose what language the clergy uses to speak to the people. And apparently every country starts with a liturgical language representing the language of the clergy, which is used in the rituals and the scripture. Mentions here that Eastern Orthodox countries variously use languages like Greek or Church Slavonic. That is accurate for that particular period. Some religions do not allow you to choose your language. So obviously Catholics will not be allowed to choose another language except Latin, and Islamic countries will not be allowed to use anything else except Arabic. We have here, for example, the liturgical map mode. As you can see, all of Europe is basically Latin, all of the Middle East is Arabic. You have Chinese in Asia, Pali in Southeast Asia, and Sanskrit, of course, for the Hindus. And there's a pretty massive mixture of Sanskrit and Arabic over India, since it represents both the Muslim and the Hindus, right? Now, the market language represents the lingua franca, or the free language used between the merchants. It is based on the dominant language of the burghers in the market capital. So if your market capital is in Constantinople and the burghers primarily speak Greek, then the market language is going to be Greek. If the market capital is in some Turkic province, say Ankara, and primarily the burghers are Turks, then the market language is going to be Turkish. Also mentions the more market power, the more contribution to the language power. So having a market in your language is a massive advantage. We also see here the languages at the start of the campaign. So Hungarian for the pest market, Italian, Cisalpine, a lot of Greek. Almost all of Anatolia is Greek, as is most of the Middle East. Arabic, Persian, and around the Persian bits, and as you would expect, Chinese, and so on around Asia. West Slavic, East Slavic, Germanic in the north, French, Occitan, and Spanish. Court language represents the primary language used in formal proceedings and in the government, of course. Court language can also be changed at will, so if you feel like you want to speak Latin in your court, go ahead and do it, right? Take note though, your court language can be determined from your primary or accepted culture, your ruler, or your overlord country. So an example of this is, say you're playing as Wallachia and you're a vassal of the Turks. You can choose Turkish as your court language if you have them as your overlord. Having a more powerful court language is desired by nobles, so choosing Turkish as a court language might actually be a meta when you become a Turkish vassal. However, if you don't choose the same language as the commoners, it will piss them off. So you also got to keep that in mind. And the burghers are happy if you make the same language as the market language. So if you say, yeah, I guess you probably want to stick with the local language that everybody speaks, really. That probably would be the middle ground, wouldn't it? Also, the clergy want the liturgical language to be the court language, as you would imagine. Most countries start with the same court and common language, but there are some exceptions. So we see, for example, here on the map, French is the court language in France, but it's also the court language in England because this is during the period of the Plantagenets, and they are, of course, descendants of the Normans, which spoke French. So French during this period is still spoken as the court language in the English kingdom, in the Kingdom of England. Surprisingly, there's Latin spoken in Hungary, Romanian in Wallachia, the irony in between these two, honestly. And then, as you would imagine, Turkish, Greek in the Balkans, South Slavic, Italian, Latin in the Vatican, unsurprisingly, Latin in quite a few of the Germanic city-states and various states, as well as in the Teutonic Order, in the Livonian Order, it's also Latin as court language. Next up, culture groups, which, take note, are independent of language and current diplomacy. Rather, they represent a more geographic or genealogical connection, so when a connection to the ancestors before the division happened in cultures. We see, as an example, the British culture group, where we have cultures such as English, Northumbrian, as well as Cornish, Welsh, Highlands, and so on. So this is a culture group, even though the cultures might have completely different language groups and so on, the culture group is still the same. So you can expect, as you would imagine, Basque to be in the same culture group as Spanish, even though the language is different, simply because it represents the customs, which might be a little bit more similar than you would imagine in that period. Culture groups do give small opinion bonuses and make cultural acceptance a lot cheaper. As an example here, your primary culture needs to be in the British culture group to form Great Britain tag. So you can form it as the Anglo-Irish, for example, still. Also, a culture can belong to multiple culture groups. So we have here the Norse Gael, which is a culture available in the Isle of Man and the Isles, and it is a part of Celtic, Scottish, British, and Scandinavian culture groups. So there's multiple culture groups for each culture. Before we set off, we also have a div diary for Southeast Asia, where we've got the new and improved version of Southeast Asia. We have the Kingdom of Dali in the north, Dai Viet, Champa, old regulars, but we also have the Khmer Empire, and Thailand, or Siam, is significantly more divided now, as is Ava for that matter, and we have a pretty big impassable terrain mountain range here between the Indian parts and the Burmese parts. Also, I would assume that all of these guys, or at least Mangsua and Dai Viet and Champa, and the Kingdom of Dali are tributaries of Ming, as are a couple more of the Burmese kingdoms in the north, but we have a lot of independent Thai kingdoms. There's also quite a few society of pops. We have some of them that we knew from before, such as the Zhuang people, but we have some new ones like Bru people, Hareni, and so many more. There's also quite a few really good natural harbors, one of them next to Bangkok here, and another one in the Khmer Empire, and the cultural makeout is just insane. Hope you guys enjoyed this dev diary. Love you all, and I'll see you in the next one.